Hey, good morning. I'm Patricia Murphy. It's Wednesday. This is Seattle Now. Sneezing, coughing, itching, headaches. It is allergy season again, and the Pacific Northwest's allergy seasons are getting longer and more intense. We'll hear from a local clinical allergist on how to fight back in a minute. But first, let's get you caught up. Seattle Council member Maritza Rivera is calling for an audit of the grants given out by the city's Human Services Department. This after a King County audit found lax oversight with its own Human Services Department, which allowed improper payments and potential fraud. Rivera says she's calling for the audit because Seattle works with many of the same organizations that King County does. No word yet on whether the city auditor will act on her request. Two major drug manufacturers are suing Washington state over a new drug pricing law. This week, Governor Bob Ferguson signed a bill into law that requires drug makers to give discounts to more hospitals and clinics. Currently, pharmaceutical companies have to give large discounts to rural providers and those with mostly low-income patients. The Washington State Standard reports the companies Novartis and AbbVie say they'll lose tens of millions of dollars under the new law. And be aware, if you've received a text message that says you're overdue paying a traffic ticket or a toll bill, delete that. It's a scam. State Attorney General Nick Brown is warning that fraudsters are posing as government agencies like the Department of Licensing and demanding payment. In some cases, messages even threaten arrest. Brown says these types of scams are becoming more common, and they're also very difficult to prosecute. Check back for more headlines on tonight's episode of Seattle Now. There are a couple of ways to tell it's spring in Seattle. The cherry blossoms and flowers are blooming, and maybe so are your allergies. And if it seems like your runny nose seems to last forever, well, science communication group Climate Central determined Seattle's average allergy season has gotten about 12 days longer since 1970. Dr. Raul Devey is a clinical allergist and immunologist at Virginia Mason Franciscan Health. He's here to tell us why and how you can handle this allergy season. Raul, thanks so much for being here.
No, thank you guys for having me. It's an honor and privilege to be here. And I'm really happy to talk about, something that's very near and dear to my heart, and something I'm sure folks in Seattle and the Pacific Northwest are experiencing pretty acutely.
Honestly, that's why we wanted to do this show. I have spent the last few days sneezing. I am not the only one. It seems like we're in allergy season. What's going on right now?
Sure thing. So, as we see, our key indicator here, of course, in Seattle and throughout the Pacific Northwest is when the cherry blossoms start to blossom. And so that lets us know visually times are changing, the seasons are changing, and therefore the pollens are coming out. And, one key misnomer I definitely want to squash right now is folks say, those cherry blossoms, they really bother me. I say, don't blame the cherry blossom. They're beautiful, but they're not the ones actually causing your allergies. It's very closely related trees. They're actually all in the same family within the rose family. And so this would be alder and birch, and they very much make up the vast majority of the tree pollens here in the Pacific Northwest. And so when the cherry blossoms blossom, as do those alder and birch trees,
don't blame the blooms.
Exactly. Get out there, definitely go take your pictures at the quad, enjoy the beautiful season that's upon us, go out and have those picnics. But, with that, of course, people need to be cognizant of the potential risks, especially if they have significant sensitization to those trees and those allergies if they feel it afterwards.
It seems like we had a pretty warm February. I noticed the cherry blossoms blooming last month. It's not the first time, but how is this showing up for people?
Sure thing. Yeah. So we've seen that those cherry blossoms have bloomed perhaps almost 4 weeks in advance of when they should, not to be ominous, but I always tie cherry season here in the Northwest to the Ides of March. And so we are about 4 weeks earlier than we should have. And so when we see that early bloom of the cherry blossoms, that lets us know that this may be a harbinger for a very early and perhaps a potentially intense season in terms of our tree pollen allergies.
It feels like my allergies are worse. Is allergy season actually worse here in the Northwest?
Yeah, that's a great question. Over the past several years, over the past 5 years, we see that our freeze-free periods, both here in the Pacific Northwest and also nationally within the United States, have extended. And so what that means is that the trees, right, they're not going to be the ones looking at the calendars. They are going to be responding to the environment around them. And when they see that the actual freeze-free periods are longer, that's telling them, hey, it's going to be sunnier. It's going to be warmer. That's more food for me to let's make some pollen. Let's get that into the environment. And so over the past several years, we have noticed the actual physical pollen counts and pollen burden has increased. So you're physically coming into contact with more pollen. And unfortunately, it will result into some more intense symptoms.
What are you hearing from your patients? What is this allergy season meaning for them?
Oh, fully. We see it in the clinic on a daily basis. We see a huge surge of our patients here who say, whoa, I feel like I'm being hit by a bus, I'm being hit by a truck, other moving vehicles, trains, and much more intensity. And folks say, hey, a couple years ago, I got a couple sniffles, but didn't really do much to me. Now I feel like I'm completely incapacitated. And it's a consistent thing we definitely are hearing from our patients. And, I feel sometimes like a broken record saying this is going to be the worst pollen season on record. And I've repeated myself multiple times basically over the past several years. And I feel like, it is, it's just kind of the cycle of worsening pollen burden. And thus, folks are just really feeling it real hard.
Is there a way to protect yourself ahead of time? How should you think about allergy season?
Sure thing. So, as we know, allergies are going to happen. The trees are going to blossom. It's the beautiful cycle of spring. As the gloom lifts in Seattle and the Pacific Northwest, the trees will start to blossom. So ways to protect ourselves. One is definitely in terms of environmental controls. And so I know it gets stuffy, especially during the gloom in the winter, and we want to open our windows. But letting those pollens into the house will definitely expose it, even though you're not outside. One key thing I always, am a big believer is air filtration, especially in the indoors. HEPA filters are the real thing that will make sure that we get all those small particles, be it pollens, dust, folks with cat and dogs, the dander truly, along with the mold spores as well. And, as we see our grasses growing greener, folks are going to be outside gardening. Of course, that's going to be instances where we're going to be exposed more to pollens. And so for folks who are really, really susceptible, I would recommend wearing a mask, even just a plain surgical mask. It will cut down on the sheer amount of stuff that you are exposed to. And, a simple fix is, I don't want people to feel like they need to avoid the outdoors. We're in the Pacific Northwest. We're surrounded by so much beautiful nature, the mountains, the rivers, the sound. And so I want folks to be out there. And so, if you need to wear a mask, awesome. When you come back, I would recommend showering. It physically will wash off all the pollens, all the stuff that's coming onto your person as well.
How should people think about medication? Because I know certain people will go out and they'll get a couple of sniffles, but some people get completely nailed. They can't breathe. Their eyes are all swollen. Is medication a good option?
Sure. That's definitely something to consider. Of course, this is a personal decision for every individual based off of how intensely they are feeling these symptoms, along with, of course, having discussions with their primary care physicians and other healthcare professionals. One key concept, don't want to get too technical here, but, something I think people can relate to is the fact that this getting, keep on harping about hit by a bus. Why does that happen? It's a concept we call priming. We think of primer in terms of paint on a wall. It's a very similar concept. These pollens, of course, don't exist year-round. There's very specific seasons. I got my tree season, we got our grass season, weeds, molds, and the like. And so our body will effectively forget that the pollen exists. But when we see that first pollen for the first time in the season, our body says, hey, I've seen this before. It's a rally of the troops, a call to arms, and our immune system gets very revved up, hence why we don't feel so great when the trees are blooming.
I didn't get my first sinus infection until I moved out here. I spent most of my life not dealing with seasonal allergies. Is it possible that allergies either come on late in life or go away on their own after a time?
Oh, most definitely. Our immune system is constantly evolving. I myself am, from the greatest state in the Union, New Jersey. And so back home, really didn't experience too many symptoms. Moving to Seattle with all of our beautiful nature, definitely, I also had my first sinus infection, first year living here in Seattle. And things can change. Folks will notice when I was younger, I was much more affected by the allergens. Now, not so much, vice versa. pregnancy potentially can also have an impact as well. There can be multiple different types of immune changes that can allow us to either gain new allergens or perhaps lose them, for better or worse for some folks.
Okay, that's our physical self. You mentioned being a broken record about how much pollen is in the air. Should we expect our allergies to get more severe? Is this just going to keep getting worse?
That's a great question. In terms of the sheer amount of pollens that we're seeing in the environment, we are seeing that as the years go on, there is a significant increase year to year. Will there be a plateau? Potentially. There's only so many trees that can blossom. But with that token, that means more folks are going to be exposed to these pollens, so there's a higher chance of potentially developing allergies. And, we see in our allergy clinic that incidence of allergies, be it environmental allergies, food allergies, insect and venom allergies, are increasing in the general population. And so I do foresee it overall, unfortunately, increasing.
Do you talk to your patients about this?
Oh, most definitely. We see, I'm really lucky enough that I'm able to see both, kids and adults. I've trained in both pediatrics and adult medicine. And so we see the full progression of parents who have seasonal allergies, asthma, food allergies. And then, of course, we have a discussion in regards to their young ones, their infants. Will my child be at a higher risk of developing seasonal allergies, of developing food allergy or asthma? And so it's a very key and core concept that we definitely see in our clinic. And we want to make sure we educate our patients about in terms of potential risks and risk stratification when it comes to allergies.
How much of this is a climate change story, Doctor?
Sure. So we see that, with this report that we are referencing, that overall we see a year-to-year change in our climate and the fact that we have less freeze-free days, we have warmer springs. In some regions, we have wetter winters, and all of these changes accumulatively will have an impact on how the plants and environment really responds to the changes in heat, in moisture, aquifer levels. All of this plays a key role.
Dr. Raul Dave is a clinical allergist and immunologist at Virginia Mason Franciscan Health. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was truly an honor.
Appreciate you listening to Seattle Now, and thanks to our generous donors for making this show possible. This podcast is hypoallergenic, so you can rate and review safely in your favorite podcast app. Today's episode was produced by Vaughn Jones with help from Anna Marie Yanni. It was edited by Caroline Chamberlain Gomez. Our production team also includes Andy Hurst, Brooklyn Jamerson Flowers, and Paige Browning. Greg Kramer does our theme music. Seattle Now and KUOW Public Radio are members of the NPR network. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tonight for Evening Headlines.